Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francescagraham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners, to another great episode of the Star Chamber. Da, da, da. Today we have with us a fantastic guest, Colonel retired Basil Catanzaro, who serves as an adjunct instructor at the Joint Special Operations University. He is a combat veteran and a partner at Intended Consequences, LLC. Colonel Catanzaro retired from the Army after 34 years of combined enlisted and commissioned service. He enlisted in the Army in 1986, serving as an infantryman and in military intelligence. After 8 years as an enlisted soldier and attaining the rank of Staff Sergeant, Colonel Catanzaro earned his commission as an infantry officer through the Officers Candidate School in 1994. And he also served in 2nd Ranger Regiment. It's not in his bio, but we talked about it before we got here, so pretty awesome. And I'm slightly biased on 2nd Ranger Regiment. Anyway, so in 2003, Colonel Catanzaro became a civil affairs officer, Fort Bragg, woo woo, where he served until his retirement in 2020. Your face just went down, Basil. I don't think you're at Fort Bragg, which, sorry. Colonel Catanzaro participated in Operation Just Cause in 1989 to 1990 in Panama. In 1993, he participated in the Haitian Refugee Relief Mission. He deployed 6 times to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. He has also spent many years planning, executing, and leading soldiers in the conduct of special operations, stability operations, and civil affairs activities throughout the Middle East, South, and Central Asia from 2003 to 2014. He held a Bachelor's of Arts in Russian Studies from George Mason University. Oh, that's right down the street from me. A Master of Science from the Naval Postgraduate School in Defense Analysis, and a Master of Science degree in National Security Strategy from the National Defense University, highly underqualified. Since retirement, Colonel Catanzaro has worked as an adjunct instructor for the Joint Special Operations University, where he teaches classes to foreign special operations units globally. He is also a founding partner of the Intended Consequences Group, LLC, a service-disabled, veteran-owned, and woman-owned small business that provides a highly capable team of civil affairs, civil military operation, and special operations force practitioners. Doesn't say globally, but it sounds like it's probably globally. Sounds pretty cool. Very, as Ryan said, wow, very, very underqualified.
Before I'll say it again, I feel very inadequate after reading these bios. So welcome aboard, Basil, or for our British listeners out there, Basil.
Thank you for saying that, because just so our viewers know, prior to coming on the show, I was dying. All I had in my head was Basil Rathbone. I know I'm dating myself. If you don't know who that is, so if I say Basil throughout the show, please forgive me, Basil.
Well, that's quite all right. And Basil Rathbone was a phenomenal actor. Yep. The original Sherlock Holmes, as well as the Sheriff of Nottingham from the original Robin Hood. And he also had a spin-off cartoon, Basil of Baker Street, the Great Mouse Detective.
Deep cut. I didn't know that one.
I have never seen that.
So it was a cartoon, Great Mouse Detective, made after the
that's fantastic.
Sherlock Holmes character. And then also, Sorry, you also have, Basil
Yes, that's
from
true.
Austin
Yes.
Powers.
But I have the one I have in my head is Basil Rathbone in the Robin Hood with Errol Flynn and Basil in his red gold outfit just spewing spite and disgust at the peasants. It's so well done. It's so well. So speaking of spewing spite and disgust, a real quick disclaimer for our Poindexters of the
That's
crew.
great. Great
That was
segue.
a good segue, wasn't it? The opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the United States Army or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or government organization. What do we say, Ryan?
Suck it all, you
Second
Basil
point.
Poindexters out there.
So, Dexter, you and your hate, disgust,
Yeah,
and your
and you're spewing hate.
spew and hate and disgust. So Basil, see, I did it. I did it
I
right
did. That's
there.
on me. I said it.
I
I
was
have
so
injected
practiced.
it.
Oh my
I'm
God.
sorry.
Yeah, I
Oh,
was,
man.
so
That's on me.
Basil, please welcome again to the show. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much, first of all, for being here. I'm always excited and appreciate being able to, talk about my background, my career, and my experiences with my time in the military, post-military, and more importantly, with the amazing soldiers and service members that I've served with in my 34 years in the military. You kind of gave a very good synopsis of my career in the military, although I've experienced far more than just what was in my bio. As you can imagine, 34 years active duty, E1 to E6, O1 to O6, so private through staff sergeant, second lieutenant through colonel. I've been around the world and I've seen a lot and have developed tremendous relationships over that time with the most amazing brothers and sisters in uniform that our nation has produced. So I'm excited to talk about them and myself and everything that I've experienced
Well,
over
thank you.
those
Thank
three
you
and a half
again. And
decades.
just for a little bit of background for our audience, so you had initially reached out to me on LinkedIn and volunteered yourself as a podcast guest, which is wonderful. It takes a lot of pressure off us for finding podcast guests and or convincing people that it's okay to come on. And you had said that you have a lot of experience within the military and post-military, specifically with this idea of trauma and suicide and resiliency, dealing with trauma, isolation, etc. And in my response to you, I said, hey, that would be great. I think that would be really fascinating to talk about during the podcast because one of the statistics that Ryan and I talk about quite a bit is that in the most recent DoD suicide evaluation report, most recent one that was published was 2013, which is a little bit ludicrous. We haven't seen one since then. It's 2025.
23.
Or excuse me, 2023. Thank you. The data showed that of the active duty suicides of that reporting period, 29% of them were undergoing some sort of legal or administrative punishment or legal or administrative process prior to them committing suicide. With that background, if we could just jump right into your first talking point, which is suicide and resiliency.
Sure. So actually, the first experience I've had with suicide was right before I joined the Army when I was in high school. My cousin's husband actually committed suicide, and she was an older cousin, so her kids were actually my age. And that was the first time I was faced with a suicide. And I don't have to tell you how impactful that was and how emotional that was and how much it affected our entire family. So I've actually had to deal with suicide from a very early age. And I saw the effects of that suicide on my two cousins as they've grown up. But then through the military, I've had many friends, colleagues, subordinates who have committed suicide. Most recently, actually was just a couple of months ago, I had a friend who committed suicide 10 years after he retired. I've had a friend while deployed, he was actually a Navy SEAL, committed suicide while deployed in Afghanistan, and I had one of my companies was attached to his task force in Afghanistan. So I've dealt with a lot of it throughout my career, throughout my life. Very, very difficult thing for anyone to deal with. And one of the things that I have really found, especially with the most recent one that I've had to deal with, is many people who end up committing suicide. One of the contributing factors is their self-isolation, and they isolate themselves and they don't deal with things, they don't talk. And I'd say this is very typical of men. I also have recently started a 501c focus on men. And, one of the things that we've learned statistically is over 70% of the men in the United States don't have somebody with whom they can be completely open and honest and transparent with. And the result is they hold things in, they bottle things up, and they very easily turn to isolation. This was a case with my most recent friend, and I won't say any names just to protect his family. But he isolated, and even after he committed suicide, his wife kept apologizing. He loved you and he loved all of you guys, but he just really isolated and wouldn't open up. And it's so dangerous when we isolate, and that's why community is so important. I have another friend who is a retired Navy SEAL who is now a pastor of a church, and he works with veterans, and he's working very hard to try and turn that around so that he can reach out to people who are struggling. And he's told me he's had veterans who were sitting in a bathtub with a gun in their mouth, and people reached out, and especially at this very critical point in his life. And because of that community, because of reaching out, he said, you saved my life. If people hadn't kept reaching out to me, I wouldn't be here today. So, the military has got all sorts of programs, and I see all of these things about stopping veteran suicide, and we've got all these programs and all of these stuff available. But I would say that the number one thing that we can do to combat suicide is developing that community and reaching out to our brothers and sisters, even if we don't think they're in danger of hurting themselves, but just constantly keeping in touch and keeping that community, and people knowing that they have someone that they can call at any time is the difference, literally.
Basil, first of all, thanks for coming on, and I really look forward to this conversation for many reasons. We got so much to discuss and so little time, sadly. And I think for me, the main reason why we're very interested in this in the foundation is, and people have bickered with us over the statistics about the DoD suicide prevention report with the 29%, but here's a statistic that is indisputable, which is over 95% of our foundation clients suffer from some sort of mental health or emotional trauma, usually driven by moral injury when the system, the military institution, betrays them. And so this has really gotten my attention, because what's not really looked at, and it's difficult to look at, is the path from the service member to suicide. And the VA, the Veterans Affairs Department, gets a lot of flack for suicide prevention, what they're doing, what they're not doing, etc. But that, so to speak, path, I argue many times, the majority of times probably, begins while in service. And then it trails down maybe years later and ends in a veteran suicide. And then there's a hullabaloo about what the VA is or is not doing. But I'm interested to get your thoughts on the root causes. And you brought up something which I was looking up while you were talking. I didn't realize that over 93% of suicides in that 2023 report, at least over 93%, are men. That surprises me. It's something I don't think was really discussed at length in the report in terms of root causes or fixes. I think your ideas about community, because we're brought up, especially, I'm just going to speak on all of men's behalf, right? We're brought up to be these type A personalities. There's the enemy, kill, accept no pain, that's weakness, etc. And so when we start struggling with our own demons, so to speak, it really clashes with that kind of bravado, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think part of the problem is, and not getting political, but you know, what defines what true manhood is. And I think this is something, especially over the last 20 years, that we really can't understand that. And from many perspectives, men show no emotion, or men show too much emotion, or and there's confusion about what it means to be a true man, and I think that's especially true in uniform. I think we've had many decades where we've dealt with this toxic masculinity, or the toxic leaders, because they don't know what true masculinity is or how to express true masculinity. And I think that one falsehood of what a true man is that you just hold everything and you bottle it up. Well, I kind of liken it to the whole Mentos in a Coca-Cola bottle analogy. You put a bunch of Mentos in Coca-Cola, what happens? It explodes. Well, put the Mentos in the Coca-Cola and then put the cap on. All of those gases are just building up and building up and building up, and they've got to have some place to go. And the problem is so many men are taught to just bottle up everything, keep everything in, but eventually it's going to come out. And if we don't deal with things, if we don't talk, and if we don't have men, brothers to walk alongside us, men are going to explode. And I'm not the least bit surprised about that 93% being men who commit suicide, because men by nature do not open up and they don't share. When I talk with men, and I operate in my men's ministry, you can get two women who've never met, and you put them in a room together, and within 30 minutes they're going to know everything about each other. They're going to know, their favorite color, just everything. You put two guys together and they'll spend 5 hours on a golf course, and they won't know anything about each other beyond what is their favorite football team, what is their handicap, and what's their favorite beer. And you can say, well, that's not true. I know one person. Well, yeah, there are always exceptions to the rule, but by and large, that is by nature what men and women are like, and how they are very different. We don't, as men, we don't share, we don't open up, and we're taught to say everything's fine. But we do that to our detriment. And it's something that has really got to change. And that's one of the reasons why I started this 501c reaching out to men. And what I've realized, I always thought it was an American issue. Now having been to over 30 countries around the world, mostly in Africa and Asia for work since I've retired, but this is something that's common globally. There is a serious, and I don't use this term lightly, there is a crisis in manhood globally. And the results are either suicide or gender-based violence. And or sometimes both, but there is a crisis because men don't know how to be men. And so again, when I say that I'm not surprised that 93% of veteran suicides are men, these are some of the underlying reasons. And then Cheska, your comment about the 29% being under investigation, I can understand that. I myself went through an investigation that took 2.5 years until I was cleared. And ironically, it's not because I was a whistleblower. It was because whistleblowers came after me when I was a battalion commander, and they were false allegations. But having been through an investigation that took 2.5 years, delayed my promotion to colonel by 15 months. And oh, by the way, as I mentioned when we talked, the investigation started when my first wife had been just diagnosed with cancer. And while she was going through chemotherapy, I am dealing with being investigated by the IG and thinking that my career has ended because of the false allegations against me. And I'm going through that, watching my wife literally die before my eyes. So I've walked through these same paths that a lot of these soldiers and service members who have committed suicide. I've walked through the same path that they have. And I was at that point in my life, literally
You
my
brought
entire
up a few
world was
interesting
collapsing
points.
in on me.
You might not have heard our episode where it was our kind of random potpourri episode. We're kind of talking about highlights and lowlights of our time in the foundation. And Cheska's low light, and she's going to recap it here because there's a chance you haven't caught up with all the episodes. I know you're an avid listener, but the low light for Cheska, her work here was an eye-opening journey into the suicide prevention programs. I'm chuckling, I jest here, that are available. So she's going to kind of recount that, but as she does, think about if you're in this position where you're already averse to seeking help and you're on the fence because to seek help is some kind of weakness or perceived as some kind of weakness, and then to go through what Cheska is about to describe.
Yeah, what Ryan's talking about was this is probably about 6 months ago. An Air Force officer stationed overseas at an embassy reached out to me and asked for help, asked for the foundation's help. She was a whistleblower, and immediately after becoming a whistleblower, she had an investigation initiated against her, and she was told that she had to stay home. And she had been at home by herself for several months at that point, I believe. Linking into what you were saying, Basil, about isolation, whether it's self-isolation or isolation by the unit, like intentionally isolating people. And that's something I'd like to talk about a little bit later. And one of the many issues that she was having was that she was having a mental health crisis, and she was trying to receive counseling therapy. But she was in a difficult situation because she was at an embassy, so she was not near a military treatment facility. The nearest one was a country away in Germany, and she was not in Germany. And she was being told that, well, you're flagged, you're on restriction, you can't leave your home, but you have to go to these appointments, your initial appointments, you have to go to them in person at this military treatment facility. And so I told her, okay, fine. Well, let me see if I can make some phone calls because I'm in the States and I'll call. So I started calling every single resource that I could possibly think of to give her someone to talk to. I called the military one source crisis, suicide crisis line. I called the VA. I called the Red Cross. I called the Army suicide hotline. I called the Joint Staff suicide hot. There's all these different hotlines that we're told about exist if you are in a crisis and you need to talk to a mental health provider. And she said she needed to talk to a mental health provider. And I think it was about 2 hours. I was on the phone, bouncing between different phone calls, talking to different people for about 2 hours. And over that 2 hour time frame, I did not find a single person who was willing to speak with her. Every single end went back to, well, she needs to make an appointment at a military treatment facility and speak to a therapist in person. Even the military, military one source crisis, suicide crisis hotline. She needs to talk to a military treatment facility. I'm like, well, but she can't. She just can't. And so this is about 2 hours of that. And I was thinking, not only was I still detoxing from my own experience coming out of the military, and so I was still in a difficult mental space at that point. And I'm thinking to myself, I was like, well, gosh, if I were her and I were in it right at this moment, I were restricted to my house, I couldn't make an appointment. And I started putting myself in her position, plus dealing with my own mental detox or mental health detoxing coming out of the military. And it was a very, very, very difficult situation for me where I was sweating, heart palpitations, all the nausea, all the stuff. And I finally contacted her. I was like, hey, I got nothing. Like literally, I have nothing. I had called over 20 different phone numbers, emails, nothing, nothing.
Crazy, crazy.
And so you talked about isolation earlier, Basil. I would like you to, both from your thinking about your experience as an enlisted member, E6, E1 to E6, and then also as your experience as an officer, I'm sure that you saw these administrative legal processes many, many times in your military career. What was our experience is that every single person that is going through one of these processes, they are being actively isolated by their command and by their peers. And you add on that this self-isolation tendency that people have because they're embarrassed, they're feeling betrayed, their lack of trust, all this other. So those things combined, can you talk through your experience? Did you see the same thing we've seen of the units actively isolating a person and what can be done about that? What should be done about that for commanders who are like, oh well, I shouldn't talk to this person because they're under investigation. I don't want to compromise the investigation because that's the excuse the commanders give.
Yeah, sure. So first, I have a mentee that I've mentored for many years, and she was in a very similar situation. She was a victim of sexual harassment working in an embassy in Europe. She was Army though, and of course was isolated because it was an embassy, and they actually put her on an airplane and sent her to the States. So, and with no notice. So she was going through, I mean, given almost no notice, and she came under investigation after she made accusations and tried to file a sexual harassment report. And then all of a sudden she's under investigation. So it was obviously very retaliatory, shocker there. And she was very struggling. Fortunately, she was sent right here where I was living. I didn't realize we're neighbors. I'm out in Centerville, Virginia. But, she was sent to Alexandria, and I was living in Alexandria at the time. And so she automatically had a sounding board, someone to take care of her. I took her to the Pentagon to be interviewed for this investigation. And it was a classified investigation because everything that they were dealing with, it was top secret. So, we had to go in special vault. Fortunately, at the time I was cleared, so I was able to go in with her. So she had at least one person that was in her corner, which kind of goes back to support systems. And I think that is so key. And unfortunately, so many people get to this point and they don't have a support system. And gets back to the prevention rather than treatment. You have got to have a support system in place for anything you do in life, because whether you're military or civilian, you're always going to face that time in your life where you're lost or you're going through a crisis. So let me back up a little bit to my situation. In 2015, my wife and I just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. I was at War College, and she had been going through a lot of medical issues. She was told she was dealing with allergies, acid reflux, anxiety. Bottom line, she was misdiagnosed 5 times at military hospital. And in July of 2015, she was diagnosed stage 4 lung cancer. 86 days later, she was dead. Thank you, military healthcare system. So I am now faced with the most tragic thing I've ever faced in my life. My daughter had just turned 13, 12 days before my wife passed away. So here I am with a 19-year-old son, 13-year-old daughter. And in the military, we do a great job preparing spouses for the inevitable because we're expecting that the service member is going to get killed in combat. We don't do anything to prepare our service members for the death of a dependent. And I had no idea how to handle this. I didn't even know the bank account numbers, our passwords and everything. So here's my wife, 86 days diagnosis to death and going through chemotherapy, last ditch efforts to try and do something. And she's trying to explain to me what bills we had, what the bank accounts we had, and all this other stuff. And I will tell you that there were three communities that got me through everything. So I had my family, my brother, my sister, my father who went through the same thing with my mother when she had cancer and he had to deal with all of that. My brother, my sister, my nephews, nieces, cousins, aunts, and uncles. So my family was there and they were there to provide support. I had my military family. At the time, I had just arrived to Special Operations Command headquarters down in Tampa. I got there 2 days after my wife had been diagnosed, and my military family was there, and I had a lot of friends came alongside me, and whatever you need, let us know. We are there for you. And to the point where 12 days before my wife passed, it was my daughter's 13th birthday. They came together and threw her a luau 13th birthday party, brought
That's
food,
awesome.
brought
That's
decorations. I
awesome.
mean, it was amazing. And then I had my church family who was there to provide support for me as well. So, when you look at a Venn diagram of my biological family, my military family, my church family, and I had some people, many who were in that Venn diagram who were in both. I had members of my family who were in the military. I had military family who was in my church family. So, and that was the only way I was able to get through things. It wasn't through military programs. Now, I will say at the time, Special Operations Command has a care coalition who is phenomenal in providing support. They flew my wife's best friend from Hawaii twice to Tampa. They got provided that. They helped me with doctor's appointments and stuff like that. But that was kind of the icing on the cake. The true support that I got were my three families, my biological family, my military family, and my church family. And that was something that I had throughout my career. And that is why I mentioned before, community is so important. And if you don't have that when you enter into a crisis, you're already in a losing battle. The military can only do so much because most people are not going to open up to somebody that they've never met. You go into a doctor's office and, well, tell me what's wrong with you. People may open up if they're desperate enough, or they may, sometimes people like that anonymity because they don't know you and they're not prejudging you. But in my experience, the best support comes from those communities, those networks that
So
you
true.
already
Can you
have in
talk a little bit
place.
more about you had mentioned during that time frame that you were also under investigation. Did you
Yes.
feel any sense of isolation or ostracization as a result of that investigation? And I ask that not to gloss over anything that you just now said about your different support networks. I ask that because of our people that we have helped with the foundation, over 460 people. Every single person has felt actively isolated and ostracized by their command and by their peer network when they're under investigation, including Ryan and myself.
So yes and no. So the investigation was for when I was in battalion command. I didn't find out I was being investigated. The investigation really didn't start until after I had come out of command and I was at work in the War College. So I will say that when I was being quote unquote interviewed by the IG, they came at me like I was guilty. I was, and I say this, I told you in my bio, you read that I had been military intelligence. Not only was I military intelligence, I was an interrogator when I was enlisted. And I know how to interrogate. I know what an interrogation looks like. And when the IG sat down with me, it was not an interview, it was an interrogation. and I was guilty. But I was not the whistleblower. I had a couple of NCOs came after me, and they were claiming that they were whistleblowers, they were not, because the issue that they brought forth, my command sergeant major and I had already addressed. We had already brought it forth to the IG, and we had already dealt with the issue. So by them saying that they were whistleblowers, they were not, because it was something that we were already addressing as a command team. And oh, by the way, the issue was that they were saying that we punished them for being whistleblowers through their NCOE, their evaluation reports, and that they received less than stellar evaluations, even though one of them was a PT failure, was overweight, and had spoken publicly against his supervisor in front of a bunch of other NCOs. And then the other one was just an incompetent NCO. So these were two substandard NCOs, both of whom should have been put out, but because we were giving them the benefit of the doubt, and this was before they became whistleblowers, they had been given passing evaluations. So I would say that I felt kind of isolated from the IG, the way they handled it. And then everywhere, and the fact that the investigation took so long. We had created an environment in the military over the last 20 years where leaders were afraid to do the right thing because of investigations and then because of being falsely accused of things. So what we ended up happening from my perspective was you had leaders who were phenomenal leaders, and they just got so tired of the environment that they got out. They were not going to put themselves in jeopardy for doing the right thing and risk being investigated, so they got out. Then you had leaders who didn't want to come under scrutiny, so they just swept things under the carpet and they would not do the right things, and they just passed things along. And then you had a small minority of us who did the right things, and because we did the right things, we faced false accusations and we suffered because of that. And it created a very weak leadership environment within the military, and we had leaders who were not doing the right thing because they just didn't want to face being scrutinized and false accusations. And I will tell you, as a battalion commander, I've got put someone in Leavenworth because of sexual abuse. I put a first sergeant out of the military because of sexual harassment. I put I had another soldier who I investigated because of sexual harassment, and I recommended that he had his promotable status taken away and receive a general officer memorandum of reprimand. And chain of command supported me in that. And because this officer, who was a captain who had been promotable to major, didn't want to face the sexual harassment when, after an investigation, and he found out his punishment, rather than telling his wife that he was being put out of the military for sexually harassing multiple women, he ended up committing suicide. So yes, he was under investigation. He committed suicide, but he was guilty and did not want to face the consequences of his actions of sexually harassing multiple women in my command, which I was not going to brush under the carpet. And I, did it. He ended up committing suicide. So I experienced, when I was going through this investigation, I had chain of command would not deal with this investigation in a timely manner. I spoke to IGs outside of my chain of command, and they saw the investigation and how long it was taking. They're like, if this came through my IG office, it would have been done and over with within 6 months. But for mine, it took
Why do you
over
think
two
that
and a
was?
half
And the reason
years.
I ask is because Ryan and I recently did an episode where we were responding to Secretary Hegseth's recent speech on September 30th and his memos that he released on the same day. And one of the talking points that he raised was that the IG and the EO system has been weaponized by, and I quote, complainers, ideologues, and poor performers who are trying to derail leaders' careers. And Ryan's and I response to that was the IG is not the one that makes personnel decisions. It's the commanders. And so our response is, well, it's the commanders who are weaponizing the system, not the IGs themselves. The IGs are just a tool of the system. Being under investigation is just a tool, but it's the command that says, I am going to stick you in your house for 2 to 3 months and tell you you can't go to this military treatment facility. I am going to remove you from position and give you a GOMAR, and different example, give you a GOMAR, General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, even though the investigation was unsubstantiated. I am going to select pieces of this investigation that favor an outcome that I've already decided upon and punish you and give you a letter of reprimand, Air Force, instead of GOMAR. I'm going to give you a letter of reprimand because even though the evidence from the investigation shows unsubstantiated, I still believe you did something wrong, therefore I'm going to punish you, or I'm going to allow the person who sexually harassed you or even sexually assaulted you write your performance evaluation. And that those are all command level decisions. Those aren't IG decisions. Similarly, for you, for your investigation lasted 2.5 years. To me, in my mind, that's a command level decision. That's not a IG level decision. Or was it in your case an IG level decision? And why do you think that it carried on for so long?
So there's a lot in there. From my experience, okay, and keep in mind, I retired 5 years ago. So anything within the last 5 years, I'm not very privy to. However, I will say that from what I have seen, most commanders take IG investigations and take their recommendations. And again, this gets back to my comment about we produced a generation of very weak leaders who cannot make decisions and they do what the IG tells them. Two, the IG that was handling my investigation was incompetent.
Yes. I was gonna say issue two,
They were
competence.
very
Yes.
incompetent. Yeah. And I spoke to the command sergeant major of the major command, and he actually put an NCO into the IG office because they were so backlogged and so slow in dealing with their investigations. And he put in a sergeant major to try and help facilitate the bureaucracy within it. And it turns out that when the command sergeant major of this major command said, I'm putting a sergeant major, his name is so and so, and I started laughing. And he's like, "What's so funny?" I'm like, "Well, when I was a captain, he was my team medic." So I called the sergeant major and I said, "Dude, what's going on?" And he's like, "Brother, I have looked at your investigation and it is literally binders and binders and binders." And I'm like, this is ridiculous. The Rosenbergs were tried in a fraction of the time than a simple thing that I was going through. The IG just I mean, they were digging into so many things, which was absolutely ridiculous. And the commanders were afraid to talk to the IG and say, what's taking so long? Because they didn't want to be responsible for providing undue command influence into the IG investigation. And the IGs, from what I have seen, I have a friend who retired as an IG. The IGs, you say that they are a tool for the commander, but I would tell you that IGs have got a lot more power, or at least they did have a lot more power than being just a tool, because commanders, again, are afraid of getting involved in the investigations and they just sit back and let the process go rather than saying, hey, this is ridiculous. Why is this taking so long? And in my case, it was it really was an open and shut case. And it was absolutely ridiculous that it took 2.5 years to get through this thing. And it had to go all the way up in the bureaucracy because once I was cleared by the command, then because I was on the colonel's list, that is a congressionally approved promotion list. And it had to go through so much bureaucracy all the way up to the Secretary of Defense's office and Congress to, I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. The bureaucracy that we have created to get through these processes. And, oh, by the way, I'm raising a teenage girl on my own now. I'm still on active duty. And I actually was about to just drop my retirement paperwork when my wife passed because I didn't want to have to work in military job. But the director of the CARE Coalition at Special Operations at the command, he's like, you have worked so hard to get to this position. Don't just throw it away. And I will tell you that the military, the chain of command at that point, Special Operations Command, General Votel, who was commander at the time, was phenomenal in leading. And then I got a compassionate reassignment back to Fort Bragg to work at Special Operations, Special Warfare Center. And my chain of command there was very supportive. And, I was able to, continue on and do at least 3 years as a colonel. But I will say this, the special operations community versus the conventional is very different. And they were, from everybody that I know, provided so much more support than the conventional military. As a matter of fact, the day my wife was diagnosed, she said, one, she says, don't hate me, please forgive me, because she had lung cancer and she was a smoker, which is a whole nother discussion about her misdiagnoses. But after that, she goes, thank God that we were in special operations because she knew that we would receive far better care than we would have in the conventional military. So I credit my special operations community and chain of command. Ironically, they were also ones in charge of the IG who was conducting my investigation. So, kind of love-hate relationship there. But the support I got was phenomenal outside of the
A
IG side
question
of the
popped up
house.
as I was thinking about your timeline. So the investigation started after you left battalion command and you were at school, lasted 2 something years. School lasts 1 year, if correct me if I'm wrong on that, for War College. And then you moved to Florida after school, and investigation is still
Mhm.
ongoing. Were you flagged?
Yes. That's why I
So
said my promotion to colonel was held up for 15 months. How did I
right, and
move if
that
I was
that goes
flagged?
back to my point earlier about the commanders are the ones who make the decisions on personnel, not the IG. And the regulation says very clearly, it's not a doctrine, it's regulation says no favorable personnel actions, period, if you are flagged. That means no, and it says no professional military education. You went to War College, you graduated War College.
So I was not notified of the investigation until
Right,
I was
but you
in War
technically,
College.
according to the flag rules, you should have been suspended from War College pending the outcome of the investigation. But it was a command level decision to leave you there. You're also not supposed to PCS, and you're also so this is just really talking again about, I mean, I'm glad all those things happened. That's wonderful. I mean, if you had been forced into the isolation that so many of the people that we support were forced into, at the same while you're under investigation and at the same time that you're dealing with the death of your wife and the very sudden death of your wife. I mean, that one of the folks that we spoke with, this Army Lieutenant Colonel, he had to stay because he didn't have lodging here, but he was flown back here. He had to stay in a hotel room on Fort Belvoir for almost a year by himself while he was under investigation.
Crazy.
And he's one of those people that you spoke about earlier. He was in the bathtub with a gun in his mouth. And the only reason he didn't pull the trigger was because 6 months earlier his son had been born. overseas. He married a foreign national. His son had been born overseas, and he had not been allowed to visit his son yet because he wasn't allowed to go overseas because he was flagged. So it's really it gives a your story gives a sense to commanders who are out there who when I say to you, I say, look, guys and gals, commanders, command teams, first sergeants, colonels, generals, whoever, you have the ability to save your soldiers' lives and your
Amen.
servicemen members' lives.
Amen.
If Basil, if you had been pulled out of school, as the regulation says you should have, if you had not been allowed to PCS to Special Operations Command and had all that support network, if you had not then been allowed to have a compassionate reassignment to Fort Bragg, so you had the availability of those support networks with you, you would have been completely isolated. But those were commander level decisions not to do that to you.
So with my case, first of all, I was in War College here
Yep.
in
Yep.
I went to National War College in DC, and I actually had family here. So if I was pulled out of school and told to remain here, I was living in Alexandria at the time. I actually have family here. I have cousins. I had I actually had a very strong network here. So that part, I still would have had a network. However, I understand what you're saying. I don't know whose decision it was to leave me in War College though, because at that point, I wasn't promotable. My promotion board had met, but the list had not come out yet. So I wasn't being controlled by COMO yet, the Colonel's Officer Management Office. So I still was being controlled by my branch. So I didn't have a commander other than the school chain of command, which was a commandant. So I'm thinking it was my branch that was the one that kept me in school, or I'm not sure. So it wasn't a field, regular chain of command commander who made that decision. I think it was branch and HR or HRC, Human Resources Command, that made that decision. I'm not sure, but I do understand with you what you're saying. My mentee that I mentioned, she had been in an embassy, was brought to the States, pulled out of the embassy, and she was same thing. She was living out of a hotel in Alexandria for a year until she finally realized that they weren't going to send her back to Europe, and they reassigned her here in the DC area. So she finally got an apartment and, settled in until she finally retired, which she was a rock star and she should have, been promoted to colonel, but she ended up retiring as a lieutenant colonel because of everything that happened. And, it caused a lot of depression, and, she was a physical fitness fiend, but ended up, because of depression, had some other medical issues, it just destroyed her career. Even though she did get one more promotion before she retired, really destroyed her career. So yeah, I was not, in my case, which kind of gets to my point though, no matter where I would have been left, I had a support network anywhere I go, because 34 years in the Army, I've been stationed all around the world. And it kind of reiterates my initial point about having that support system and that support network in place. And no matter where I went, I had that. So, eventually after my compassionate reassignment to Bragg, I ended up coming up here to the DC area, and then I spent my last 3 years here in the DC area and retired here and stayed here, which was a blessing because, the end of the story for me was I met somebody here, I got remarried, who is now 8 months
Oh,
pregnant
congrats.
with my third child. So, there is a happy ending to my story, although tragic path to get through here. It has ended well because, when I was going through, my wife had just died. My kids were devastated, and I'm not going to share my kids' story because they're adults and, it's their own story. But suffice it to say, they were tremendously traumatized because a newly 13-year-old girl doesn't know how to deal with watching her mother die, nor does a Army Ranger Colonel, civil, special operator know how to raise a teenage girl by himself. or my son who was 19, who, was a mama's boy, had a very tremendously special relationship with his mother. No, neither one of them know how to deal with that trauma. So, the path that I went through to get here, and when I was going through all of that, you know, watching my kids deal with their trauma, being investigated, watching my wife die, all of those things all at once, I very easily, had I not had the support system I had, very easily could have gone through the same path that so many of my brothers and sisters have gone through and made the wrong decision. But, the resiliency that I had, my faith, my three families that I mentioned before, my biological family, my military family, my church family, carried me through.
And thank God your story ended well. Unfortunately, for I think it's 17 veterans a day currently, the story does not end so well. And a lot of those unfortunate endings, I submit, have roots in active duty experiences. And as the report would state, some of those negative experiences have to do with the very thing we're talking about. Basil, I want to say thank you for coming on and sharing your story. It was a very complex conversation there. It took many different directions, which was actually great. It tied a lot of themes that are very much in the forefront of the news and military advocacy circles and what we're doing. We talked about the inextricable, I argue, link between mental health and administrative kangaroo courts, such as IG investigations. Talked about weaponization of the system. We talked about command's influence or lack thereof, or the tail wagging the dog, I guess, depending on the perspective you want to look at. But the takeaways that I got from our conversation, and I want to thank you for highlighting them. First of all, you've hit the support system many times. I couldn't agree more, which I find incredibly ironic and hypocritical at the same time when the military purports, and by the way, you said you've been retired for 5 years. Nothing has changed on any of this. So you have missed zero beats here as it pertains to the IG star chambers of justice. But support systems, like I find it mind-boggling. In fact, when we purport the importance of having a support network, and then, well, for instance, Jessica can't even find a person who would answer the phone, and or you're under investigation, or you're the complainant in an investigation, and you're afforded no counsel, no representation, no military counsel, no guidance, no training, nothing. This is why Walk the Talk Foundation exists, simply because it doesn't exist in the military, which it probably should. Not to mention any kind of moral support that you don't get going through that. You talked about the length of investigations in these processes. I couldn't agree more on that. It's Chinese water torture from a psychological standpoint, subject or complainant, right? Both are being put through this purgatory. And it's like, just get it done. Like you said, like I mean, like, who shot JFK lasted shorter than some of these IG investigations that are really straightforward. I mean, there's a lot of these investigations are not complex, and it kind of boggles me why in some ways it boggles me why they languish. But it's in part due to the third aspect, which you nailed, was the competency of inspectors general. They're just amateurs. Let's just face it. They have no real training on how to run an investigation. They came after you for whatever reason. They didn't like you, or the command said, don't, get this guy, or fulfill a foregone conclusion, whatever the case may be. They didn't conduct it professionally. Part of that professional investigation is a timely one that just gets to the heart of the matter and get on with life, right? And when you have inspectors general with 4 business days of training, which they did when you were in, which they did when I was in, which they still have, they're just amateurs. They are not investigators, but then they're tasked with investigations that they're woefully underqualified to do. And then finally, I think this is the biggest point that we're really seeing come to the forefront in this debate is strength of commanders. Like we have, I don't know how this happened. Maybe somebody smarter can explain it to me, but over time, we have slowly mission crept, if we want to use a Sam's term, to this kind of where commands lead by fear, and not imparting fear, They lead because they are afraid. In my day in the Air Force, the measure of success for a lot of commanders, sadly, was, well, I just don't want to get fired. Right? I don't want the IG coming after me. I don't want an EO complaint. Oh, God. And they abdicated and forfeit responsibility, authority, and thereby leadership because the measure of performance, measure of success just became, I just don't want to get shot at, proverbially, right? And that has really started to erode over time. And we really see it in the work we do at the foundation. We see it in almost every case, if not every case, where there's a juncture at which point a leader can just go, this is crazy. Like your case, an investigation for 16 months, that's absurd. Knock it off. Or we had a gal on a few weeks ago, like she got promoted and then it just got undone. And then she never got promoted for like 4 years. And anybody with the stars or birds on their shoulder could have just gone, knock it off. Like, just is absurd. You shouldn't be flagged. Unflag him. But nobody in that chain of events had the moral courage to intervene, and instead just went, well, JAG said, well, the IG said, and they just kind of threw their hands up because that is what is incentivized and rewarded, not the moral courage, not leading, not rocking the boat. That doesn't get you the promotion nowadays. And I argue that that is a huge contributing factor, if not a root cause, in all of this. Cheska, I leave the last words to you, but thank you again, Basil.
Yeah, thank you, Basil. Really appreciate it. And the only thing that I will add, because Ryan did a phenomenal summary of everything, as per always, is for all the Poindexters out there. Ryan said something that many veterans say at some point in my day in the Air Force. So just so everyone knows, his day was 1999 to 2022. So he's not, some 1970s person talking about in my day, it was so much better. That's all I had. That's your humorous content for the day. Basil. Last word to you, sir, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Again, thank you for opportunity to share. I think that one thing I would like to leave with listeners is develop your network, your community, your tribe, whatever you want to call it. And you've got to have people to walk alongside you, and you need to develop that before crisis happens. No matter how bad things are, they will get better, believe it or not. I had people tell me, I was going to a church when my wife was diagnosed, and the pastor was talking about challenges and stuff. And he goes, no matter how bad you think it is, it could always be worse. And I used to think, yeah, you could be like me. I thought I was the worst that everybody was measuring against. And I never thought I would get through the other side. But, as Winston Churchill always said, if you're going through hell, keep going and don't give up. Suicide is not the answer. It may seem like the answer, but it makes things so much worse for everybody that you leave behind. And then I will close with one note about leadership that, Ryan, you kept hitting on there. As I mentioned, I have a men's ministry, and I talk about authentic manhood and our definition, which is a faith-based definition, but it's very simple. Authentic men reject passivity, accept responsibility, lead courageously,
love it,
and invest eternally. And leaders, if they applied, if you take, the invest eternally, whether you have faith or believe or not, if you take even just the first three and apply that to leadership, we would have so much better leaders. Reject passivity, accept responsibility, and lead courageously. And if we did that, I think 90% of the problems that we face could be eradicated.
What a great way to end the show. Thanks, Basil.
Thank you.
For all our listeners, we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.